I witch ballet, and I do all kinds of witchy stuff and art and fun things like that.
I'm Tanja Laden, and this is the woman who married me, my husband. So
It's true, we broke into the Beverly Hills County Courthouse.
That's what we did. I'm actually a writer. I wrote about Maja for LA Weekly, and last year I did a cover story on Cameron, the artist, for LA Weekly as well. And that's who I will be speaking about today.
My name is Sabina Magliocco. I'm a folklorist and a professor of anthropology at California State University, Northridge. And I've written extensively about modern witchcraft, the witchcraft revival, and Neopaganism, and ritual as art. And that's what I'm. That's nice.
Yeah, which would please my family very much to know. So, I'm also a depth psychologist. I teach at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, and depth psychologists would have much to say about that in the state of leaving the element. So I'll leave the interpretation out for tonight.
My name is Rochelle Martin. I'm a Chicana artist. I make jewelry, and I'll share a little bit more about my story.
Okay, so we're going to start with Jennifer to kind of get a historical background on the issues that we'll be talking with.
Can you all hear okay in the back? Is it good? Okay.
Yeah.
So I come from a background of depth psychology. Depth psychology resembles no other psychology because it is not a science. There's nothing wrong with science. There is something wrong with scientism, which joins the ranks of racism and heterosexism as an ism which touts a superior worldview over all others and thus becomes narrow-minded, intolerant, discriminatory, biased, and bigoted. Psychology over the last century has succumbed to scientism, which means it has fallen prey to reductionism. I have a mind, therefore I am. And this is more than ever true today when we can literally peer inside of the brain and scan its topography. I have a brain, therefore I am. Depth psychology is not a study of the brain, and it's not a study of the mind. Depth psychology honors the etymological roots of the word psychology, the logos of the psyche. Psyche is an ancient Greek goddess whose name means soul. Psychology literally means the meaning of the soul, and this we cannot find by scanning the brain. Depth psychology resembles no other psychology also because it's not a study of consciousness, or not just a study of consciousness. Depth psychology posits the deep unconscious and studies what is underground, under the surface, the invisible presences and absences which haunt us. Depth psychology posits the personal unconscious, a la Sigmund Freud, that the personal unconscious, that which is mine and only mine, my dark soul. And depth psychology posits the family unconscious, that which lives in the ecosystem of family members who are living and those who are ancestors, all of whom are still exerting their influence in us and through us. Depth psychology posits the cultural unconscious, that which lives in the many and multiple cultures we take part in, those cultures we live in and that live within us. And depth psychology posits the collective unconscious, a la C.G. Jung, that deepest level of the unconscious that belongs to all of humanity, that sinks down into the deepest level of the deepest roots of human time on Earth. If psychology as scientism focuses on the brain as the way to understand human behavior, depth psychology might offer instead the image of a tree and ask you to project with your minds the image of a tree. If you can imagine a really, really beautiful full oak tree with a nice solid trunk and then roots underneath that mirror the oak tree on top, the roots there. We might say, depth psychology is interested if not even more in understanding what lies below the surface of the visible tree than it is the manifest tree itself. We might say depth psychology is thoroughly rooted in the roots of the tree, that which we know is there but we cannot see, the unconscious in all of its levels, the dark and fertile soil below us. Keeping with the theme of tonight, depth psychology is interested in the dark paradise as much, if not more, than the light paradise. Is interested in the paradise of the moon, as much, if not more, than the paradise of the sun. Depth psychology also resembles no other psychology because it posits, a la James Hillman, that we live in an animated world, that there is no spirit and matter divide, that all is spirit, all is ensouled. The rock has a soul, the cat has a soul, the clock has a soul, and I have a soul. The soul is in me, yes, but I am in the soul. The tree does not say, I have nature. The tree is nature in the natural world, and we too are nature in the natural world. We don't go into nature. Nature is in us. We are nature, and we're always in nature. We don't have a soul. We are soul, and we're always in soul. I make these statements about depth psychology because I want you to see that it's part of what Kristin invited me to speak on tonight, the perennial wisdom tradition. Traditional psychology as it is taught today is not part of the perennial wisdom tradition. Quite the opposite. It opposes the perennial wisdom tradition. It contradicts the perennial wisdom tradition. It scoffs and mocks and is disinterested and dismissive of the perennial wisdom tradition because it is not concerned with soul. And soul is exactly what the perennial wisdom tradition is concerned with. I know I'm being hard on science, and I'm drawing sharp distinctions, and perhaps I'm being hyperbolic, but it matters right now that we fight against isms. And I'm fighting against psychological scientism as a civil and human rights issue, and I'm saying our psychological lives matter. The lives of our soul matter, and the lives of our ensouled, enchanted, incandescent material world matters. And we are also ensouled, enchanted, incandescent material matter. With my sharp words, I am attempting to be responsible, which means to be able to respond. And I am responsible for and responding on behalf of the life of our ensouled, enchanted, incandescent material world which matters. Not more than ever, but it's always mattered. And that's perennialism, an ism I support, a word that refers to the everlasting nature of nature, the everlasting matter of matter, the everlasting soul of soul. Perennialism is also a word that is connected to spirituality and to the world's wisdom traditions. And this tree here helps us to understand perennialism as well. Let's envision the tree as the tree of time, and the deep roots are all the ancient spiritual traditions. Buddhism and Sufism and goddess spirituality and shamanism and Native American wisdom, Native American earth traditions, and Islam and Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism and paganism, and on and on. These roots, some are deeper than others in the tree of time, but they give rise to modern forms. They branch out and they become our neos. So we have neo-Buddhism and neo-Sufism and neo-paganism and neo-shamanism, and in general, neo-perennialism, which we could define as the modern manifestations that branch from the trunk of the tree that is deeply rooted in ancient wisdom and spirituality. Neo-perennialism matters because it is a response to current conditions, and it is responsible to current conditions. It acknowledges that we are trees deeply rooted in the ancient soul, and we are here now, so very young and new. Neo-perennialism is an ecological movement, in that it says if we want to keep this tree alive, we must both tend to the roots and its shoots, its branching offshoots. And these branching offshoots must be responsible, which means they must be able to respond to current conditions. Psychologist Stephen Gilligan says we are challenged now to, quote, cultivate spiritual traditions that resonate with contemporary consciousness and forge new ways of creatively dealing with how differences bump up against each other. This the branches of our tree must do. They must. They must respond to the conditions of contemporary consciousness. If it's very windy for a decade, our branch will strike a new pose, grow a new angle. It will get responsible. And if our branch grows and bumps into another branch, it will do as Gilligan says and have to forge new ways of creatively dealing with that bump. It is able to respond, our neo-perennial branches, because the tree itself is fundamentally creative. As this exhibition is fundamentally creative. As our souls are fundamentally creative. As each of these women I share this table with are fundamentally creative. And although we are all unique leaves on our unique neo-perennial branches, my particular branch being my interest in archetypal psychology, which is connected to the wisdom tradition of depth psychology, which is one of the many roots of the tree of perennialism. Though we are each and all of us here tonight on our own unique branches, we are also and always the same tree. The new age is the old age renewed. And renewed it must be. The roots need the tree to be a living tree. They need the tree to branch. The roots lay under the surface of the tree and they delight in the movement above. Keep growing us, they say. And they grow too below the surface in response. The branches need the roots as well. They hover over the roots and take sustenance from them and give sustenance to them. An everlasting and ever vital exchange similar to the one between the sun and the moon. Keep growing us, they say. So we too, we infinitesimal and still important human beings, need to study our roots, need to draw sustenance from the ancient spiritual and wisdom traditions, even as we are co-creating the new, which is a response to current conditions. We need to hold the tension between the saying that there is nothing new under the sun, which is true, and you can never step in the same river twice, which is also true. We need to hold the wisdom in our country's motto, e pluribus unum, out of the many, one. One river, one tree, one sun, one moon. And our country's shadow motto, ex uno pluris, out of the one, many. Many rivers, many trees, many suns, many moons. Many artists, like the ones we celebrate in this exhibition, and one artist, which is the dynamic creative soul in the world and of the world, and we are that soul too. There is nothing new under the sun, and you can't step into the same river twice, and still we create because it is our nature. We are natural creators because we are nature too. And what of the trunk? If the branches of the tree of depth psychology are the personal unconscious, and the roots are the unconscious, the familial, culture, and collective unconscious, and if the branches of the tree of perennialism is all its neo-perennial offshoots, and its roots are the collective spiritual wisdom tradition, what of the trunk? What connects the soul above with the soul below? We can return again back to ancient Greece and remember that in their mythological and cosmological psyche, Psyche was married to Eros, the god of love. The trunk of the tree is love, is Eros, is the great connecting, uniting principle. The trunk loves branches and the trunk loves roots. The trunk loves the earth and the trunk loves the sky. The trunk loves the sun and the trunk loves the moon. The trunk loves the new and the trunk loves the old. The trunk is Eros and the trunk is Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. The tree of perennialism is the tree of Sophia, Philosophia, philosophy, for the love of wisdom, for the love of psyche, for the love of soul. So together, let's sit down on the earth and lean our backs against the trunk of the tree of Sophia. We who are here for such a short time, the tree much longer, longest. Feel the tree's back, its trunk, supporting our back, our trunk. We need the tree, the perennial tree. We need its wisdom roots, and we need its neo-creative shoots. When we lean our backs against the tree, our backs are straighter, stronger, and we are supported. Our legs can root through the grass and into soil and into relation with the earth below us. And our arms can branch out, and our fingers can move like leaves in the wind under the sky and sing their creative song. Tonight and in this exhibit, We honor some of those songs, and we remember to sing ourselves too. We who are also very old and very new too.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to save Q&A until the end. And thank you very much. That's awesome. And now Tanja is going to give us an introduction to the life of Marjorie Cameron, which you may or may not be familiar with. And just as an example of somebody who really committed to living her life as her artist.
And before,
Do you want to show it first?
yeah, before I speak about Cameron and her art, I wanted to show a film that was made in 1955 by sorry, no one's hearing me. Can you hear me? Okay, I keep this out of my own voice. Sorry. So this movie was made in 1955, don't worry, it's short. Curtis Harrington was a filmmaker who himself I would probably define as a perennialist in a way. He worked, had a day job working as a director of schlocky made-for-TV movies, and at night made amazing, crazy films. And he made this film about Cameron in 1955. And after we watch it, I want to talk about it.
Kristin, could you pick the links for me? There's a slider next to it too. Thank you.
For a solid rocket fuel that we still use today. He did it through setting off rockets in the desert, through black magic rituals, and chanting the hymn Pan. That desert is now JPL, and NASA was created to oversee JPL. And he blew himself up in a mysterious explosion in 1952. He was friends with L. Ron Hubbard, who stole his money and his girlfriend and bought a yacht and started Scientology. And all the while, Cameron was making art, and they were married. And after he died, she kind of went on this journey spiritual journey where she started off with Aleister Crowley and the teachings of the OTO, but it really kind of morphed into her own sort of do-it-yourself religion, and art making was very much a practice, a part of her religion. And a lot of what you saw doesn't exist anymore. She burnt it. She made thousands and thousands of artworks, and she burnt a lot of what you see. So that's actually a record of the only record of some of her paintings. She was very much an itinerant woman. She was homeless a lot. She was friends with the LA Beats, Wallace Berman, Dennis Hopper, Russ Hamlin, whole Ferris Gallery scene, but she was always an independent woman. And to me, in the end, and we were just talking about this, as interesting as her late husband's story was, her story is even more interesting to me. Because not only was she an artist, she lived her life as an artist. And that's an important distinction to make. And even while she was making art in the 1940s and 50s, that style that you see was not popular at all. It was very much out. It's, to me, very forward. It could be made today. So she did not fit into the canon of that mid-century modernism, abstract expressionism role that most artists who were successful at the time fell into. At the same time, I firmly believe that she created the LA art scene. in the 50s, because there was no art scene where it was like art for just one's own, to feed one's own soul and to make it part of your life. It was highly commercialized, and even, you know, some great artists like Ed Ruscha still working day jobs as commercial artists. She didn't. She never even wanted to sell her art, which made it increasingly for her impossible. So she lived pretty much, you know, in the moment, taking the most interesting parts of different religions and exemplifying, I think, what it means to be a perennialist today. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about her, but I think that without someone like Cameron, we wouldn't really be able to be doing things like this show. And she paved the way for us to really make art to feed our own souls instead of to satisfy other people. That's my spiel. Sticking to it.
Sorry, just a quick question before we go on. Can everybody hear?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I told you that I was a folklorist and a cultural anthropologist, and that I teach in an academic department. And although anthropology, I suppose, is a social science, because I'm a cultural anthropologist, I'm about as humanistic as you can get, and because I'm a folklorist on top of that, that makes me even more humanistic than my straight anthropological, cultural anthropological colleagues. So what is folklore? Folklore is a discipline that is older than anthropology. It goes back to basically the middle of the 1800s, the period of romantic nationalism, and it is a discipline that studies expressive culture and informal knowledge. In folklore, we look at everybody as a creative artist. You may not be painting, you may not be taking photographs, but you may make beautiful meals. You may know just how to create a Halloween party for your niece that leaves everybody just thrilled. You may be a terrific joke teller. You may be someone who revels in telling spooky urban legends. All of those things are genres of folklore, they're forms of folklore, and what makes folklore so compelling is that it is the expressive culture, the art of everybody. We are all folk performers, we are all artists on some level, on that informal level. You don't need to, I mean, you can, of course, go to art school and produce art, and that's great, but at the same time, we are each able to bring that out of our souls, from our souls. Revival, witchcraft, and modern paganism. This is part of modern paganism is an umbrella term for religions that revive, reclaim, reinterpret, and play with ideas about ancient pre-Christian practice. Marjorie Cameron was very much one of these mid-century people who belongs to the pagan revival in many ways. She not only was a very creative person, but she played with these ideas, for example, that came out of the Ordo Templo Orientis, Aleister Crowley's magical society. And she and Jack Parsons were both very interested in magic, which is one of the touchstones of the modern pagan movement. Now, in order to understand magic, I think we've got to stop. We don't want to think about prestidigitation. So this is not pulling rabbits out of hats, this isn't making people disappear, and it's also not really what we see in Harry Potter. Instead, I think it helps to think of magic as a creative process. It helps to think of magic as a way that, as the life force that moves through us when we create something, and as the life force that moves through the world to create anything, really. We are all products of that life force, because at some point, two individuals loved one another, made love, and we were the result of that. But if you look at nature around you, everything in nature is also a result of that process of magic. It is that process of transformation that takes the creative impulse and creates something new out of it. So for pagans, I would say that they are all very creative people, or most of them are very creative people, but probably the premier creative form is the art of ritual. Ritual is a series of events set apart from everyday life that dramatizes or enacts a transformation. And it can be an internal transformation, or it can be something that is happening in the outside world. So for example, a rite of passage that moves an individual from one stage of life to the next stage of life. Or a ritual can mark transformations in the year cycle. We're about to descend into those last 6 weeks that go from Halloween, really, to the time that the sun is reborn at the winter solstice, that dark night of the year. And so in many parts of the world, there are rituals that mark that external transformation. Okay, Marty. But there can also be rituals that mark transformations deep inside of us, either initiations into a particular order, or perhaps initiations into a new stage in our own lives, into which we initiate ourselves, as I think Marjorie Cameron was doing in some of the things that she was.
Oh, look at the thing.
I'm sorry, my brain just turned goo. So they can mark all different kinds of transformations, including our own transformations, our own creative growth, and our own movement on our life's journey. So ritual, how does ritual work? How does ritual work? Ritual works really by tapping into some of those deep emotions, some of those things that Jennifer was talking about, those deep feelings deep within our souls that resonate with the cycles of light and dark, the cycles of the season, and the emotions of people around us. It does that by using things and using actions to speak to those deep emotions. And many rituals are also rooted in story. So you might want to think of a ritual as a series of events that tells a story that is designed to touch those emotions deeply, so that we don't just say, oh, I've had a transformation, but we feel utterly transformed. For modern pagans, one of the goals of ritual, at least in many denominations, is ecstasy. Ecstasy is something that takes us outside of ourselves. I'm not talking about the drug here, because most modern pagans would not advocate using drugs in ritual. They want to do it entirely through the creative process, entirely through this storytelling process. So just as an artist might paint something that speaks to us about a mood, a light, a series of emotions, ritualists in the pagan movement put together rituals that touch us deeply by speaking to us of a mood, a light, a set of emotions, a transformation that we experience as we go through this ritual, and really live this art form. Modern pagan rituals are very participatory. You can't stand in the back the way that you might, if you were studying, say, a Catholic Mass and, take a bunch of notes. This is what people do. You have to be there. You have to do the things. You have to participate in the actions. And so this artistic vision is really shared in a very participatory way with every single person there. I think that's all I'm going to say for now, because I think during the Q&A there might be ways to tie together the many things that we're saying, and you may have questions for me as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And now over to Maja.
Sure, I'll tie some stuff in too. A lot of what everybody's talking about is the same thing, because there's only one thing. So I'll do what I can to try to sew the little fabrics together, right? We can do it in this little moment in time right now, because it'll exhibit all the greater truths. That's what the perennial philosophy means. Okay, perennial philosophy is something that doesn't change. It's not like nature, it's something in nature, around nature, but it doesn't fluctuate, it doesn't die. It's the idea of an immortal thing, right? So the perennial philosophers noticed that there was nature which goes in a pattern, and that was usually exhibited by a pentagram, okay? The pentagram is Venus making its orbit around the sun where Earth hits it. That's a changing cycle, a season, right? That's something that fluctuates through this wave, right? Once you start practicing access to your subconscious, those unconscious forces of nature that have been mentioned already, you see what nature is. You see the pentagram in everything. You start to go a little crazy because you start to see that everything is this frickin' thing. Once you look at sacred geometry, once you look at the flower of life, and you look at your own face, you see, oh my God, that is me. That tree is me. I'm doing it now. Right? The example of the tree is a very accurate one. However, I will make an addition to it as well. Wood is a part of you that is your body. In Chinese medicine, they call your fleshy body all this stuff, which looks like a tree if you open it up and look inside your veins, and all these branchy things which exist in every single part of you. It's like we're a covered tree on the inside. Like if you took us, turned us inside out, we'd actually turn into a tree. But we're like a tree that's been like reversed, right? So we have this is called the Po. It's ruled by your liver in Chinese medicine, which is your animal spirit. It's the thing that my teacher that I work with, Kelvin DeWolf, in his Native American tradition, he says that's what's trying to kill you. And if any of you have a drinking problem or know people with drinking problems, you can see how your liver tries to kill you. Right? This is wood element in Chinese medicine because it's something that is strong. It grows. It has the power to give birth, to extend past itself, and to regenerate. There's only one organ in your body that can regrow itself. Do you guys know what that is? If you've heard the story of Prometheus, your liver can be almost completely annihilated and then still grow itself back. This is absolutely amazing to me. And the fact that they had a myth that described that that particular organ was eaten every day by an eagle and then regrew means somehow they knew their liver regrew, although how you can access that information from ways that we know through science is completely impossible. There's another way that we know things, and this is the other addition to the tree that I would like to offer, is that if you can't imagine that we are all trees living in this nature, which is like a big matrix, there is also this other thing that comes and kind of sits on it like a bird that comes and lands in the tree. This is spirit, this is consciousness that is in here, but also in other places that we can't really get to in here, but we can when we turn our trees inside out, right? This is when we go into those subconscious places. You can see those birds, you can feel them in yourself, and you can watch where they go and how they behave. In Chinese medicine, your other spirit, other than your Po, which is your liver, is called your Hun, H-U-N. The Hun is the other part that comes and sits. So you all right now are these two things sitting on top of each other, intermeshed. When you die, those two things will dissipate and go and make other things, okay? A lot of stuff today has been talked about with creation. But I promise you the best way that you'll get to know the perennial philosophy is through destruction, which there is too. Nature, if we think about it as a ratio or proportion, right? Like phi, like the sacred flower. If it's a proportion, it's mostly good, mostly created, mostly growing, but also destroying. Right? We got to break some eggs to make the omelet. If we're going to give birth to a child, if two people are going to come together and do things, there'll have to be some kind of stuff that is sacrificed in order to make the stuff. So if you think of nature as this giant tumbleweed that keeps like sucking everything in and spitting it back out, that's exactly our situation. You've been sucked in and spit out into this revolving wheel, which you begin to see when you access those forces in the side of yourself. If you want to see them, you can come into a wrestling match with them. There's a lot of great techniques you can use in order to do that. I practice techniques on a daily basis, which are based on Taoist and Native American traditions with my teacher, Kelvin DeWolf. We're starting a nonprofit called the Well Wishers to try to teach everybody to do this stuff because It's ridiculous to me that the Chinese philosophers and the perennialists have known this information for thousands of years, and yet everyone still walks around not knowing anything about the trees and the birds. This is ridiculous to me. So we need to promulgate this information by engaging in it within ourselves. That's done through making yourself uncomfortable in most of the techniques. Very few of the techniques that Cameron or any of us might utilize to get into this is going to be uncomfortable. You can try it really easily. Try holding your breath. You'll find your Po as the thing that wants you to breathe. Try fighting falling asleep. If you think you are an exhibition of a creative force and you're in control of everything, try just not letting yourself fall asleep. And you'll feel that force. It's like a big tug that's going to suck you in and pull you in, and all you can do is surrender to it. Unless you can manage to stay asleep, but that has a finite amount of days, right? Because you're trapped in your tree. We have the bird, but once it leaves the tree, now it's gone somewhere else, right? So the idea for occultists, for ritualists, is to try to take that you that is the thing that's doing your breathing that you're not even aware of right now, the you that is making your heart beat in your chest that you don't even know about, the you that takes you into sleep. These things that we engage in ritual activities, are trying to bring that closer to the bird so the two can see each other and reflect upon each other, take a look at each other. In the movie, you saw Cameron was sitting in front of a mirror. The mirror is probably one of the biggest occult symbols throughout history, and also was invented by the Chinese Taoists, who are some of the first people to discover the perennial philosophy in the first place. But we forget all about China, and it's destroyed its own history through communism, through these proportionally destructive forces that also occur next to creativity, right? So the artist is the one that has to sift through by going into themselves to reveal how did those people get to that place in the first place, right? Were they taught it? Did somebody tell them? How did they experience it? They started to come into a relationship with that thing that is making their heart beat, that is making them breathe, that is making them dream, through engaging in active techniques such as creative art, right? Anytime I'm going to sit down, although I do it every day, so I don't know if I count, but I can absolutely engage in these rituals before going into the creation, right? Some of you guys have heard a lot of artists talk about this. It, of course, became the most popular with the surrealists. They would talk about techniques to access the dream place, right? Which lives right back here in your brain. It's your dinosaur, your asshole, that just wants to kill everything and be the most amazing thing ever in the history of the planet Earth, right? That thing that wants to live and be dominant over everything. It lives right back here. And once you start getting in there, the first thing that happens is the destruction and the terror and the fright, because you're going to look at everything that's awful, that you don't want to see, that you've been shoving back there probably for most of your life if you've never engaged in an activity to get in there. That's why a lot of people and a lot of artists go crazy, or they don't fit in with other people. They go homeless. They can't talk to people anymore because they're seeing all these birds and trees and everybody else is talking about McDonald's. This is where we start to go outsider with some of these pagan traditions, and why people just go back into nature, because they can see, oh my God, this is real, right? So the surrealists, including Salvador Dali, would do things like, one of my favorite things he would do that I like to talk about is he would take a key and just like sit in his chair and he'd balance it on his hand as he was kind of falling asleep. And then when he felt the tug of sleep, they would fall and make a noise and he would wake up. And all the stuff that was coming up, he'd be able to write it down. That's a technique to come into an engaged relationship with your subconscious, and then he creates from that place, right? Not from the rational, awake, I'm doing everything place, but from the place that you don't know, the you don't know about, that's in you doing all this stuff right now. Right? That's what the active engagement in ritual techniques in order to create does. It gives you access, right? So the artist is really more like an extractor. If we go back to what you were saying about scientism, It's very frustrating because originally science was a technique to come into a conversation with your subconscious. Rene Descartes writes about this called the evil demon. It's on Wikipedia. Rene Descartes discovered the scientific method by having a conversation with Satan in his brain. This is where scientific method comes from. I like to remind scientismists, that's a word, that this was the origin of their theory to begin with. And in fact, scientific method arrived in Rene Descartes' mind through a dream that took place in November, right? So he has this dream through engaging with these techniques of having a conversation with Satan, right? And then he's like, this is how you think. Scientists then took that method and just do the method. They don't engage in the technique to learn how to think. Darn it, they're leaving out the most important step. Science really should be a method of testing and engaging in something, not projecting an idea onto reality and then looking for ways to make it true. Originally, science was an investigative tool into your own subconscious. So it's actually very similar to art. The word science actually means, by its nature, reduction. It means to cut apart. Art means to put back together. Proportionally, we must have both because we're natural, right? We're phi. We're the sacred flower. We need a proportion of creation. We need a proportion of destruction. So if you're off balance, you can fall one way or the other, right? Too creative, you're going to go manic, right? Too destructive, you go depresso. And then the gravity gets you, right? So you have to find, all the perennial philosophists found that immortality resides in the spot in the middle of those things. And to be a successful artist is about kind of like being a rope puller with all these pulleys to get everything in the correct proportion, which is why a lot of art focuses on aesthetic symmetry, right? Although obviously there's lots of art that looks into chaos and the destruction of all of that as well. You'll see that statistically, a majority of art is trying to mirror in symmetry some kind of creative force within the artist, right? So if you want to think about it in those terms, it's easier to include in your life when you think about this as something that we're all already engaged in, and all a ritualist or an artist really does is raise their conscious awareness that that's what they're doing. Just like you start paying attention to the fact that your heart is breathing, right? That you're alive. And once you start paying attention to things like the fact that you're alive, all of this great stuff starts to happen and unfold like a flower. And you care less about what other people think about you, like Cameron, because you see that everything is stupid anyway. And there's no such thing as perfection except in that bird that comes and lands on your tree. That's the thing that will never be anything else. All trees will, although they are sturdy and strong and can live a long time, they too fall into the kali, sucky, little spitty-outy vortex that we're all in, right? Just as the form you're inhabiting now will do as well. That's reality, right? The proportional destruction. So if you understand that proportionally there's more creation, I feel like that's very exciting. And when you come into things that are horrible, like experiencing the death of your husband, like Cameron did, in a violent, volatile way, that's certainly not anything you would ever want to experience. All his skin was burned off his body, he had no arms and legs. It was something that was absolutely horrific. But through her experience of that horror, she also learned what it meant to truly live her own life, right? Through coming into a confrontation with, that's the paradox, nature of paradox, that's also present in reality. So when you start engaging in these rituals, I encourage all of you to do it as often as possible, because it makes life a lot more fun. And certainly if you're ever going to make something, try to just do a technique to try to get in there. Do an extraction technique. Get closer to your subconscious. Stop and listen to your heart. Listen to your breathing. Hold your breath. Try to do it while you're falling asleep. Feel what's making you fall asleep. Who's making you go to sleep? What is that? When you feel it, it'll start to open and you can place, that's it, you're done. Sorry, you'll never go back to regular. Because you can't take it out of your eyes. But nonetheless, I encourage you all to do it anyway, because it's much more fun. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. You guys each have really wonderful different perspectives to
A communal perspective of spiritual transformation. I ask you to forgive me if I have like a cough attack in the middle of this discussion because I'm fighting a cold right now. But so it's like you can switch to the next slide. So my God experiences as a child were mostly shaped by my dad's role as a gospel singer and worship leader in my uncle's church. Watching him perform his art, worshiping with his voice, was one of the first ways I began relating to ritual through art. As a teenager, and especially in my years of studying Chicano studies, I started to become more and more alienated from the value systems of my traditional Baptist upbringing and started to explore other concepts of God via LSD. Where Christianity was a one-track, Jesus-centered universe, my comparative world lit professors were exposing me to all the ways our creation mythologies intertwine. And I guess I'm a perennialist. The diagram that I drew up there was one that I drew when I was having a discussion about God with an ex-boyfriend of mine, and we were kind of fighting because he didn't believe in God, and I was like, no, this is what God is. It's this thing that you can't explain, and then everybody culturally interprets it, and that's how it works. And so I was starting to just kind of unravel from this kind of singular Jesus concept that eventually transformed into this more inclusive concept of God as a reflection of cultural experience. And that's really kind of what brought in my perspective. And as my perspective broadened, it was further developed in my professional undertaking as a director of communications and development for a faith-based community organizing project here in Los Angeles. The entry point into the communities were congregations, which meant that multiple faith groups were coming together to work on community issues like homelessness and affordable housing and access to healthy food and education reform. And it was through my experiences in organizing that I was able to witness firsthand how access shaped a person's reality. I think one of the most impactful interactions I had was with the community resident named Joanne Wynn. Joanne Wynn's the girl on the left. Joanne Wynn was 25 years old, just like me at the time, and was a married mother of 3. When she first started volunteering at the organization, she had a really strong eagerness to learn, and as I got to know her, I realized that she kind of embodied a reflection of myself to me, the mirror that you spoke of earlier. She was a mere vision of what it looked like to grow up without access to higher education. And I remember a very powerful moment I shared with her in the elevator where she confessed her feelings of discontentment with motherhood. She said she wished she could be like me and work for the organization like I did and express this restlessness that she felt. And as she shared her story with me, I felt this humbling awakening to my own privilege as a third-generation, English-speaking, educated woman. And it was one of those moments where I felt like the universe had put us two together to learn something really important from each other. On the one hand, we were very different in terms of our upbringing, but on the other hand, we were very much similar in that we were both striving to become self-actualized. We both wanted to find our own purpose in life, and it became very clear to me that, like me, Joanne Wynn also was in a spiritual process. How much she was able to focus on that process as a very low-income immigrant woman with a family of 5 was obviously hindering her from feeling free to transform her reality and to truly live out what she felt she was called to do. And I had a lot of those kind of moments in organizing that definitely shaped my sensitivity to low-income communities and the way that access shapes spiritual development. And as life goes, I unexpectedly transitioned out of my community organizing role into the role of motherhood. I remember very vividly when the doctor put Venus on my chest, imagining that she would look like her dad. But to my surprise, she looked really strikingly just like me. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, it's like I just gave birth to myself. And I think that's the moment that I became an artist. And as I started on this journey of recognizing myself as an artist, I definitely came to acknowledge that my most remarkable creation is Venus. It was only after that I had Venus that I would fully allow myself to undergo this total spiritual transformation that led me to begin growing into my creative potential. During her infancy, I entered into this period of dark transition, as Maja stated earlier. I separated from her father and began turning to my art to channel the pain and sadness that I was going through, which opened up this new ritual process in my art. Every day while she napped, I would meditate and study healing stones to help guide myself through this bewildering dimension I was entering. I found myself in solitude, looking and dealing with being a single mom and allowing myself to become vulnerable to where life was leading me as an artist. Through my disconnectedness, I rediscovered connection with a community of like-minded soul seekers who were supporters of my art, who, like me, were also on this journey of self-discovery. People from all around the world literally began relating to the pain that I was expressing through my art, and I came to realize the power that art and creativity has to bring people to recognize the connectedness of beings. And I think that connectedness is what led me to my next venture as an artist and a teacher into a park program called Summer Night Lights, which is run by the mayor's office and intended to put programming in targeted areas of LA where gang violence dominates low-income neighborhoods. The first day I arrived, I brought the kids a piece of rose quartz that we wire wrapped together and attached the symbol of the sun, which represents one's own inner light. I wasn't sure how they would relate to these concepts, but as I watched these ideas, as I discussed these ideas with them, they quickly responded with interest and intrigue, and I'll show you a little short clip that a friend of mine made of the class setting. My jewelry was one of the most popular workshops in the program, and over the weeks my classes grew up to reaching 60 to 80 participants every session. I served over 1,500 kids in low-income neighborhoods, and it was through that experience that I started to understand how spirit and human intuition bend towards healing and self-healing. These children and parents who mostly were unexposed to symbology and crystal and healing crystals immediately recognized the value of these teachings and learned for themselves how to use crystals for healing. There's so many stories I can share about the kids and parents I encountered, but my mind always goes to this kid named Roderick. Forgive me for falling apart. Roderick had a natural talent for jewelry making. I noticed it right away, and he became my helper on several occasions during my workshops. I sat one night with him when there were nearly no families at the park because there was a lot of shootings that week. And he was making this beaded bracelet with the words emo on them. I'm like, Roderick, why are you making a bracelet with emo on it? That's weird. That's so like 2003. What's going on? And I asked him about it, and he explained that he considered himself emo because him and his friends cut their arms at night. And I looked at the dark community I was in, and into his own dark eyes, and I just sat humbled in my privilege to be able to drive out of the park and away from 88th and Hoover to a safe and secure home to my daughter. And as I was gathering my thoughts, I read over the co-curator's vision for Dark Paradise and was struck by the notion of the mundane. In South Central, off 88th and Hoover, the mundane is a bleak reality. I remember being there on cold nights with children barefoot without jackets, making jewelry. There were 5 shootings at Elgin Sutton Park while I taught there over a 2-week period. One of the shootings was a worker from within the park program, and I remember getting a phone call one day notifying me that I didn't have to come into work if I didn't feel safe. But this was a mundane for the children in this area. And I sat with a 12-year-old girl named Maja when I eventually did decide to go into work that day, and she explained to me why the person was shot. She said the guy who worked in the park program was riding his bike at night in a neighborhood of an ex-gang territory of his former gang, and that's why they killed him. And as I sat there with her, it stood out to me how unmoved she was as she told me the story. But this was her norm at 12 years old. I remember when I tried to make jewelry during those weeks when the shootings were happening really badly, very close to the area where the park was. All the kids were really antagonistic towards each other. Everyone was on edge. They were fighting so much that I could hardly even conduct my jewelry classes. There was one point where an older woman in her 60s was antagonizing a younger 10-year-old boy, and I took a step back that day and just started contemplating how the negative energy of the killings were permeating themselves into the spirit of the community. Not even the elderly were missed. Everyone was deeply impacted by the circumstance of death and violence in that neighborhood, whether they recognized it or not. And there was a point where I felt really helpless teaching them about onyx and its ability to repel negative energy. There was something more that they needed, but I didn't really even have an answer for them. And it led me to start thinking about who deserves to be spiritually realized and how does one come into this process of clarity in these dark environments. I went back to the beautiful words of Kristin and Meagan and reflected on the vision of Dark Paradise, and I reread this statement. Dark Paradise is one side of a utopian oasis, a realm illuminated by the moon as opposed to the sun. It's accessed through the practice of creative meditation, the end result being a work of art. In this exhibition, the artists hint at the dawning of an esoteric revival, exploring the interplay between the spirit and the mundane, capturing transcendent moments of reflection. The work explores the creation of a personal mythology to redefine the idea of a collective unconscious. These sets of experiences within my own spiritual journey led me to pose these questions to us, the artists, the seekers, the creators. This question is one I pose to myself as a member of a community of people that is seeking spiritual enlightenment. Who's allowed the space to practice creative meditation? How does the mundane shape the spirit? Who's allowed transcendent moments of reflection? And what does it mean to be a part of a community in the collective unconscious? As we turn inwards, how does our spiritual clarity align itself with the pain and suffering of the world around us? Thank you.